Hi, this is Paul, and this is our weekly Bridges of Meaning question and answer. And let's get started. Valerie is again volunteered to MC for us, so thank you, Valerie, for that. I appreciate your volunteering and being willing to do this. I didn't post a recording last week, basically because there were some sound issues with the recording. I might post some clips of it. So if you missed last week's question and answer, I don't know that I'll be able to continue to do this every week. I'm going to continue to try to do this every week. But right now with September, there's two big times of year that churches really get going. September sort of with school, and January sort of the new year, or December with the beginning of the calendar. And with COVID and all the things we're trying to do online, there are a whole bunch of other things. One of the things that we're doing at Living Stones is continuing to integrate more and more of the online people into our small group stuff. So if people, I should be careful with this invitation because we're a little church that gets overwhelmed quickly. So, but why don't we start the question and answer, because that's what we're here to do. So Valerie, have you looked past there? What do we got going this week?
We have two questions from last week that didn't get asked, so I can start with them.
Okay.
We have Charlie asked a question regarding something else that was a follow-up question of something else that may or may not make sense, but I'll just do my best to read it, what it says. It says, regarding fatty portions, how does that line up to the original sacrificial model? We now know that the fatty portions of the animal provide more flavor and fuel for human bodies. What would it have been like for those early people to sacrifice the flavorful and fuel-rich portions to God?
That's an interesting question, and it's a very interesting question. I don't really know much about it, but I suspect that you're onto something with that, with the idea that these are the prime portions. I was watching Alone. I commented on that last week, and how fat is so absolutely valuable for human beings, and animals know this, and so they go straight for the fat. These wolverines and these bears were eating the lips and eyebrows off of animals that the contestants had killed. So it probably has to do with the prime. I would imagine it's not something dissimilar to the fact that I'm working on the Passover story this week for my sermon, and you're to bring a spotless and unblemished lamb. In other words, you don't give God the stuff that you're just going to throw away anyway. It has to do with the sacrificial aspect of the offering. So that would be my guess, but I don't really have much expertise or anything more to say in that. So I'll have to leave it at that.
Okay. Does anybody have a follow-up question or another question for Paul? Okay. The next question is by Dave. Most Christians treat certain beatitudes from the Sermon on the Mount as being a prescription for specific actions or ways of being that are contrary to our instinct, being merciful, meek, pure in heart, poor in spirit, being a peacemaker, thirsting for righteousness, and the others as comfort for a suffering that is not sought or deserved, mourning, persecution, insult for the sake of Christ. But is this dichotomy between passive, active states the correct way to think about the beatitude? Is being meek, for example, ever something that just happened in the way mourning seems to? On the other hand, are we ever called to actively seek out things such as mourning or persecution alongside the other seemingly active states such as being merciful? If not, Do you have any thoughts on why the Beatitudes are formulated in this dichotomy between active and passive states?
That's an interesting dichotomy. Let me first say something about the Beatitudes themselves. It's a formula of sorts that is not uncommon in the Psalms. There's been a lot of Jesus' Beatitudes, in particular in the Sermon on the Mount. There's been a lot of discussion about them because, well, so a handy thing to do with the Beatitudes is to read them and then read the Psalms and compare and contrast how the Psalm Beatitudes look different from Jesus' Beatitudes. That's a really important step because once there's a ritual or a practice that is set in a culture, you have additional teaching bandwidth by varying it. The first song I learned when I learned to play the violin was Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and there was theme and variation. So first we learned how to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and then we learned variations on Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and those variations meant that I had to learn different bowings, different rhythms, all those sorts of things. And so once there's a theme that's developed, you can begin to work on that theme and add new levels to the theme. And Jesus clearly seems to do that with the Beatitudes, because if you read Beatitudes in the Psalms, well, they're exactly like you would imagine a religious beatitude to look like. Blessed are those who pray all the time, because they will receive what they're asking for. Blessed are those who walk closely with the Lord, because God will bless them. It's sort of this standard instrumental religious perspective. Jesus' Beatitudes, when you contrast the Beatitudes in the Psalms with the Beatitudes that Jesus lays out, Jesus' Beatitudes are quite shocking. And what this has led to is a huge amount of discussion about what on earth is Jesus talking about. Blessed are the meek. Does this mean I should aspire to be meek? There's the sort of the active state. Okay, I'm going to try to be meek. Well, that's kind of funny when you try to think that through. Now, then you have the additional layers of, we read meek in English, and we have a whole bunch of mental symbolic dramas that are connected with meek that may or may not be what original audiences had in mind, because part of the difficulty of biblical studies is you're reading something that was related in Koine Greek in the Gospel of Matthew, and then sort of questions behind it. Was there an Aramaic layer behind that? And are they referring to the Hebrew scripture? So is there another layer behind that? And so when I critiqued Jordan Peterson's take on Blessed are the Meek, I involved those two layers, which Jordan Peterson really didn't have access to. And a lot of people were a little annoyed by that, because Jordan Peterson in their mind was an authority and they sort of liked his interpretation of it. And so, who was I to challenge Jordan Peterson's interpretation of this passage? Well, there's actually a tradition behind, if you get into the Greek. So usually part of the way New Testament studies go is you read this. So which Greek are they talking about? Well, often we sort of use the Septuagint, which is a first century BC translation of the Hebrew scriptures from Alexandria into the Greek. And so then we look at word usage in the Septuagint with respect to Hebrew words. What words did those scholars relate the Greek to the Hebrew with in the Septuagint? And what you find in the Old Testament is this tradition of the oppressed and the poor and the people who have no power and the people who have no options. And then suddenly, when you understand that tradition and you see, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth, you begin to see the strange contrast that Jesus is laying out here. Because what do you mean, blessed are the meek? The meek are exactly the opposite of being blessed, because we usually imagine that blessed are the active and the forceful and the ones who take the world by the neck and force the world to do what you want it to do. And part of the Old Testament tradition with respect to the meek was the understanding that the meek look to God to meet their needs. Now you're into the passive. Okay, so there we have the active and the passive. Now, if we begin to read the Beatitudes as a prescription, well, suddenly we're taking an active posture towards a passive evaluation. And so I really love the fact that you notice the prescriptive aspect versus the passive aspect of these states, and notice the dichotomy between them, and the way that this actually plays in the Beatitude. Now, I don't think we always have the danger of what's often called eisegesis, where we're pouring something into the text. When Jesus does this kind of thing, like he's clearly doing in the Beatitudes, he's taking a form, he's taking a verbal liturgy and adding variations to it, and he's inverting things and twisting things around. I think he's clearly doing this to make us think, to invite us to engage with the material, and to ask us to deconstruct, if you will, even some of this instrumentality that is implicit within religion. And I think this is part of the reason that the Beatitudes have, on one hand, it's not uncommon as a pastor to, okay, we're going to have a council meeting and we're going to open the meeting with devotions. And so someone will open up the Beatitudes and they'll read the Beatitudes because they're beautiful. Well, what makes them beautiful? We don't know what makes them beautiful, but something in them fascinates us. And I find these Beatitudes not only working on Christians who are faithful, church-going, submissive to authority Christians, but even people who are rebellious of church authority and are skeptics about the Bible, and then they open the Beatitudes and they're like, wow, this is beautiful. And for me, as a nosy pastor, I sort of say, okay, well, what's beautiful about them? What are you finding beautiful about these Beatitudes? And well, then we begin to see other layers of Jesus' colonization of our culture. Well, I think it's just beautiful that the meek have hope when in this world, which is red in tooth and claw, in this world where the strong take the weak, that there's hope for people who have no strength. And I think part of the reason we identify with that and are excited about is because sometimes we feel that way. And we'll give Nietzsche his due, and the Nazis their due, because they sort of understood, well, if you're always sort of elevating the value of the meekness, well, you're going to harm the strength of the species. Well, okay, yeah, that's a valid observation, and you can in fact even weaponize weakness, and we see some of this in our own culture right now. But the Beatitudes, in the way that Jesus deploys them, as to be, I think, quite intentionally read alongside of the Old Testament standards, Jesus, and you see Jesus do this all the time. On one hand, Jesus doesn't just say, oh, that old book with that angry God, we have to throw that away. Jesus never pulls a Marcion move. Jesus is far more subtle. He both accepts and submits to the authority of the scriptures, but then takes them and illuminates them in a new light. And so the text begins with the Beatitudes, and then you have the light of the world. But then he goes into, you have heard it said. So now he's taking on elements of Moses, and he's not, as the text says quite clearly, he's not setting it aside, he's fulfilling it. Well, what on earth, Jesus, do you mean by fulfill? And even that word has so many layers, which are both passive, these are being fulfilled, and active, by acting them out right now, embodying them, incarnating them. I am making them flesh right now. So are we called to actively seek out things such as mourning? There are moments when one ought to mourn, but I think another piece of the Sermon on the Mount Jesus has in the prayer is, don't lead us into temptation, or another way of translating that is the time of testing. I never find Jesus, or I don't usually find Jesus saying we should seek our suffering. My position on this is that suffering will find us. And if you listen to my conversation with Jesse this week, that was part of the point too, because everyone's often looking to deconstruct others or to throw others down into their U-shaped narrative. And there's a valid place for that at times. It's certainly that and the prophetic tradition. Good old King Ahab hated Elijah because Elijah always told him things he didn't like. And there's a place for that. But for many people, trouble will find them, and each day has enough trouble of its own, as Jesus says. So there might be times when it's appropriate for Christians to self-consciously pursue a period of mourning. But in my experience, calamities find us with uncomfortable regularity. And so even in this passive mode, the Beatitude delivers much comfort by blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. So whereas many scholars would like to say, these are prescriptive or these are descriptive, I think they are sometimes prescriptive and sometimes descriptive, and often the times will find us in terms of what we need and what we want or what we don't want. So I think the Beatitudes are simply genius in what they have, and you just see the genius of Jesus. Dallas Willard, I like how he talks about Jesus in his book, The Divine Conspiracy, because I'd always thought of Jesus as holy, but I had never understood Jesus as genius or smart. And Dallas Willard just bowled out in his book says Jesus is the smartest man who ever lived. And you think, well, those seem to be two different categories in my mind. But then when you look at the Beatitudes, and if you can get an understanding of what Jesus is doing and seems to be doing reliably throughout history, well, it's just absolute genius. And the favorite quote from Tom Holland in his Dellingpod podcast that I keep ripping off from my sermons, the job of the gospel writers was to present Jesus in such a light that he would not only be understanding, engaging, intriguing, and desirable in one culture at one point in time, but to do so across the vertical cultural spectrum and across the temporal horizontal horizon. And the fact that 4 writers managed to do this And these four writers, well, Matthew and Mark seem to take things from, or Matthew and Luke seem to take things from Mark, but that four authors managed to do this in a short amount of time, and we barely know who these are. To me, this all points to Jesus himself. And as Tom Holland noted, he is the most successful storyteller or short story writer the world has ever known, by the fact that we look at these Beatitudes and people who are completely don't believe in Jesus, completely skeptical about the Bible, read them and say, wow, that's beautiful. That's meaningful. I don't know why, but they kind of grab me. Well, yeah, it's genius. And so part of the loss of modernity is that, and this I've seen in biblical interpretation. Okay, I want to find this one thing that the Beatitudes say and do. Oh, okay. This is what they mean. Okay. Well, the Beatitudes seem to have levels that like to play active and passive, like to play theme and variation, like to play, okay, whether or not you believe in Jesus, you can't simply walk away from the power and the beauty and the mystery of these words. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And just that combination of the Old Testament tradition of meek and inheriting the earth, and that tiny little phrase Jesus packs into, worlds and volumes of theology, and it's just absolute mastery and genius of imagery and language. So yeah, I would say when we puzzle over things like this, we should allow the frustration to spurn us on into deeper levels of insight. And I think the text is designed to do that. And the text is designed to motivate us to talk about it. So here we are 2,000 years later, still puzzling over this, but in a fascinating, intriguing, engaging, attractive way, which I think is exactly what the text is designed to do. So there's my answer. Keep at it.
That was really well thought out. Thank you. Does anyone have any follow-up questions or a question for Paul? No? Okay, we'll go to the next question then. This one by Grim Grizz. Paul, it seems like you're about to get the conspiracy theory part of the Bible. There is an assertion that Moses was the ultimate psyops, that Pharaoh realized the violent nature of uprisings and chose the tribes to be their middle management, so they get overthrown rather than the shadow Pharaoh. Marched them in the desert for months, so the old ways died off with the elders, while making them codependent on the food drops Pharaoh only told Moses about. I guess my question is, when you talk about that part, can you lean on why it's not that? I don't understand this one. Good luck with that.
Wow, that's a cool question. I hadn't really heard the psyops interpretation that Moses and Pharaoh are in cahoots, and well, obviously, I don't know, the death of the firstborn of all of Egypt seems a pretty heavy price to pay for your conspiracy. So he leads them into the desert, but I don't understand Pharaoh's long game in this. I could understand Moses' long game, but not Pharaoh's long game, because at least according to the story, they wind up in the promised land and not necessarily a vassal of Egypt. So it's an interesting idea that I had never heard of. That's a fascinating idea. I think the problem with that conspiracy theory again is what's Pharaoh's outcome? He could have just let them go if they're going to go to the promised land. And in fact, by letting them go, they might have been something more like an ally. So, yeah, I don't understand the long-term game that Pharaoh is playing there and trying to get at. When you talk about that part, can you lean on that? I've had too much on my plate. One of the things that I would really like to do is on my church channel, do more Bible commentary, because a sermon as a 20 to 30 minute little talk, which has to be incredibly broad, is not a terribly effective didactic tool. So what YouTube affords is actually an opportunity to go into some of these issues a little bit more deeply. And if I'd had the time all along, I would like to do some of those videos. And that's part of the reason that I always emphasize efficiency in my video making, because I very much want to sit down for an hour and get an hour's worth of video out of it to get that kind of efficiency in production. So that's a really cool idea. But with sermons, I'm always, part of the reason I often use items from the news as commentary, or at least as introductions, is because they reach a broad audience. And then I'll step them from that broad audience into at least one layer of tension and teaching in the text, and try then to deploy an application that is as broad as possible as well. So part of what YouTube has afforded in its broader bandwidth is a capacity for more information to go out. So when you get something like this, which is a theory that I had never heard of, I think it's sort of a cool idea, but something I had never heard about. Psyops conspiracy theory of Moses. Very cool.
Did anyone have any follow-up questions or another question for Paul?
Yeah, Paul, I wanted to ask you if you were aware of what's called the Apiru theory, that the Hebrews were, there was a group of Egyptian slaves that rose up and ended up in Canaan, menacing various vassals of Egypt. And people were thinking that that may be the origins of the ancient Hebrews. If you'd heard about that and what you thought about it.
I have heard of it. I haven't looked into it terribly deeply. For me, it always goes into the kind of the modernist, historicist conversation of, did it happen or didn't it happen? And if it did happen, in what way did it happen? It's sort of like like last week, I was looking at the plagues, and really plagues isn't the best English word to talk about it either, or the wonders. Then there's all these ideas that, well, there was the Nile to blood is an algae bloom, and that blood would starve the Nile of oxygen, so the frogs would flee out of the Nile, and then the frogs didn't live without the water, and so they died, and that produced the gnats because they laid eggs in the frog's body. And my take on these things tends to be, yeah, maybe, because I think implicit in both the Hebrew and Christian conception of the God is that this natural supernatural dichotomy that we tend to emphasize in the way that we do, isn't really a problem. When Elijah is running from Jezebel and there's a violent wind, well, that was a weather system. Yeah, that's what a violent wind is. It's a weather system. Now, was that a supernatural or a natural one? God isn't limited to that distinction. So part of the issue that you have with very ancient history is that we know so little and we have so little to go on. So this gets into the whole question of was Moses and the Exodus story, was this all basically a literary fabrication or a myth as it is? Now, it certainly is a myth. It's a founding story. But when I read the text, the writers and the readers all seem to believe that there's history behind this. And this gets into the question last week that I talked about. This question of historicism, that comes out of our culture too. And so I was actually thinking about this yesterday, and now I don't remember exactly what I was thinking. That's why I like making videos, because when I have a thought, at least I can get it down, and then I remember the thought better and can have a record of the thought. So that's kind of a thing that, because of our culture, we're very interested in. But the Bible doesn't seem terribly anxious about it. So how to understand the stories? Well, I think, are they historical? Yes. Did they tell history the way we tell history? No. What do we mean by historical? Well, that's really complicated. So part of the difficulty is that there's a tiny fragment that we grab onto because it's the only thing that seems to correlate. And what we can do with it, I have no idea. But the stories continue to have power. And I think part of the reason they have power is because they're written in a way that leads us to believe them as a form of history. Now, are they history exactly like we tell history? No, because we have a culture and they have a culture. But that's that type of answer. So I don't have anything specific on that theory because I haven't delved into it. Almost every time I go through these texts, it comes up. But this is our fascination with, see, the Bible's right. Okay, what do you mean by right? So that's the way that whole conversation continues to go round and round.
Cool, thank you, Paul. Okay, next question is from Random. Why does the Father God keep secrets? In Revelations, John was commanded to keep something he saw hidden. More surprising to me was when Jesus said, my foggy memory, only the Father knows special stuff, not angels or even me, Jesus.
I love this question because this question illustrates so much of what I've been talking about. So the Greek word that is usually translated by English translations, secrets, is mysterium. It's a mystery. Now, here's a problem. If I were to say, why does God, so you wouldn't say, God, why does God keep mysteries? Because in our lexical understanding of the English language, a secret is a bit of information withheld, often for a manipulative purpose, whereas a mystery is something that is sort of beyond our comprehension. Sometimes English translations will translate this mysterium as mystery, and sometimes they'll translate it as secret. Well, why on earth would they translate it as secret? Well, but if you read a lot of Greek, and there's fortunately a lot of Greek text out there, the Greek word has sort of a dual sense to it. And the way I illustrate that sense is, I'll just use a contemporary example. There's a movie that you can find, I think it's on Netflix right now, Knives Out. And it's a contemporary whodunit that is very well done. And it's a fun movie where there's this old man and there's this immigrant nurse and a snooty bunch of children who want to inherit his money and his home and his possessions, and he leaves. He dies under mysterious incidences and leaves the money to the immigrant nurse, who of course is young and beautiful and innocent and charming, and she has a really interesting psychological quirk that she can't lie without vomiting, which adds a whole new layer to the story. It's just a fun movie, and it's well done and it's well acted. But part of the fun of those kinds of stories is that there's an unfolding nature to the story. And this is a common thing in mystery novels, and sometimes people read the last page first, and because they don't like the tension. But you can only understand the story as new elements of the story play themselves out. That is part of the idea behind this Greek word. And that's a very different idea from secrets. Part of what goes into this as well is the fact that the Bible, many Bible passages, both in the Old and New Testament, recognize David, for example, sometimes says things like, "These things are too wonderful for me to know," something to that effect. Well, what does he mean by that? Sometimes we bump into things that we recognize are powerful, important, before us, but we can't fully get our minds around them. C.S. Lewis has this great example of sex and childhood, where he talks about the fact that when he was a boy learning about sex, he was trying to relate it to something that he knew. And the best thing in his child's mind, the best thing in the world was chocolate. And so he asked something to the effect of, or maybe he's just imagining a child doing this, "Is sex like chocolate? And so do you eat chocolate while you're having sex?" And an adult listening to that would sort of chuckle, because an adult who understands and has experience with sex will think, well, I understand how a child would imagine that. And well, there are some times when people combine sex and chocolate, but they're sort of living in different realms, and the child can't, and hopefully can't, understand an adult perspective, a mature perspective on sexuality, because he's just a child. And so you bump into passages like this sometimes where basically someone will say, well, the time has not fully come. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, if you're in the early parts of the movie Knives Out, the time has not yet fully come for you to understand what happened to the old man. And as with any good whodunit novel or movie, they'll show you some things initially, and after you get a little bit of information later on, those things that they showed you in the first place now look different. Another great movie that does that is The Sixth Sense. And sometimes careful watchers will very quickly, early on, figure out the trick. Others won't see it till the end, and then they'll rewatch the movie, and it's like they're watching a different movie. When the Bible talks about mysteries or secrets, it's often talking about something like that. And John of the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, uses this all the time. What is the book of Revelation? The book of Revelation, in my opinion, is a retreatment of Old Testament prophetic books like Daniel, like Ezekiel, but also Old Testament narrative, Genesis, Exodus. It's a retreatment with now the new information from Jesus. And that's what that book is doing. And so that book is full of mysteries and things hidden and all of that. Well, do we hide sex from children? Yes. Why? Because adults understand that if the child if this can be hidden from a child for a while appropriately, the child has to grow up into being ready to understand it and enjoy it completely. Can 8-year-olds drive cars? Yes. Why don't we give them driver's licenses? It's not because an 8-year-old can't physically turn a wheel and push a gas pedal. It's because what a car is and how a car actually fits into the world requires a far larger perspective on the world. The same reason we don't give children guns. We don't give children guns because guns are difficult to operate. It's because guns operate at layers that the child is not able to comprehend. Now, some children will be very offended by the fact that you're not telling them everything they want to know. The wise parent will say, that's true. I'm not telling you everything you want to know because you can't know it in the way I want you to know it. I have to wait until you've had some experiences, until you've grown up a bit, until your mind has matured, and then it will be revealed. And a lot of these passages in the Bible that talk this way are exactly like that. And there are lots of other passages in the Bible that deal with time in exactly the same way. Now, modernists hate this because modernism implies sort of a flat epistemology where we sort of know things directly. Well, here's the thing. Children will often walk into their parents' bedrooms unannounced, and mom and dad are doing something very strange, and they're not wearing any clothing. And now a 3-year-old who walks into mommy and daddy's bedroom, they might not even notice anything. An 8-year-old might walk into mommy and daddy's bedroom, and now the 8-year-old understands clothing and nudity and might stand there kind of dumbfounded, not knowing what they're seeing. The 14-year-old who walks into mom and dad's bedroom and catches them in the act, flies out of the bedroom, closes the door, is flush, and says, I don't ever want to see that again. Well, are what mom and dad doing a secret? Well, if you can see the picture, you can begin to understand why the language is laid out the way it is.
Does anybody have any questions or follow-up questions for Paul?
Just to comment on Sherry's response there too, that's right. Because everyone wanted to label Jesus as Messiah, but Jesus completely understood how that would lead them down the wrong road in terms of what his intentions and goals were, which is why he kept resisting the title. And he slyly embraces Son of Man. So when demons cry out, you're the Son of God, well, okay, well, what do you mean by that? And I know, people sometimes leave comments, oh, Paul, you're always playing the what do you mean by that game? And yeah, fair enough, I do. But the world is like that. The world is a mystery. In some ways, the world is a secret that is beyond us, and we can't understand it. And so a lot of what we do when we talk is to try to understand it better. And yeah, again, this irritates a modernistic epistemology that just says a car is a conveyance to get you from A to B. And one of the clips I want to make for my clip channel is Jordan Peterson's class where he says, is that what a car is? Or is a car a way to change the chemical composition of the atmosphere? Or is a car a way to redesign cities? Or is a car a way to reality is like that, and real things are like that. And so, yeah, secrets are a part of that.
Let's go to our next question by CW. I'm curious, is your understanding of narrative as a way of thinking about Christianity at all influenced by or compatible with narrative theology, i.e. a postliberal theology Yale school? If you are aware of this movement, I would be very interested to hear your impressions of their project.
I'm not really aware of the movement, so I can't really comment on that movement as such. I think part of the reason that if you pay attention to language, words come in and out of fashion and words come in and out of fads. And I'm using the word narrative a lot, partly because it seems to be the best word at hand for a lot of what we're trying to talk about. And I've been wrestling with this with the video that I've been wanting to create over the last week, but haven't managed to, because symbolism isn't exactly the right word. Drama gets at it, liturgy gets at it, narrative gets at it, but symbolism tends to be something of, so Jonathan Peugeot is an icon carver. He creates symbols. Letters are symbols. It's a little too small. Drama, there's a lot of theological work on drama, and that's sort of true. And you know, the introduction to the video that I haven't made yet deals with Jerry Falwell Jr. because it's just a present example. Why is everyone upset at Jerry Falwell Jr.? His wife's not upset with him. Isn't he a paradigm of someone who's sacrificing for his wife? Well, could be. And she, you know, because he's a college president and because of what happened between his wife and him and the pool boy, or that picture with him with his unzipped pants and his wife's assistant who's unzipped pants. There's something going on there that's leading everyone to imagine that these people are doing things that are unbecoming of the symbolism of his office. Now, again, the word symbolism sort of works there, but doesn't really capture it because it's not really, as a college president, he's a symbol. The word sort of works there. But what he does in his life is a drama that enacts certain other dramas that are connected deeply to meaning making and how we look at the world. And we haven't really all settled on language that seems to capture these things better than the language we're currently using. And so part of the reason we keep talking about it and writing books about it, and making videos about it, is we're groping towards better language, better logos that sort of encaptures it. And we have to do this as a community where we all get on the same page together. That's part of the reason the word narrative is getting used again and again and again, because, and this also relates to science and ideas that we have about causality, because what we're doing is we're grappling with what is causing people to act and do and think and believe what they do. And so we're wrestling with those things. And narrative is sort of the culture layer version of chemistry or genetics or these other causal tools that we look at and use. And so it's kind of the word that we have and the word that we've settled in. And even so modernism has been receding for quite a while, and there are lots of ways to recognize that. At the beginning of the 20th century, theological exegesis was very much trapped in the historical grammatical layer, and then there was form criticism and source criticism, and in the mid 20th century, late 20th century, the literary criticism came to the fore. And the reason it's really postmodern, because it says, okay, whether or not the Apiru were Hebrews, or whether or not Moses is a construct, the canonical form of the text, so pushing against form criticism and source criticism, and the narrative quality of the text is what gives value and meaning to the text. And so we should work with the text as narrative. And so the work of Robert Alter, tremendously helpful Hebrew scholar from Berkeley, developed that whole thing. Now, what tended to happen was that there's enough modernity still in the system so that progressives who were skeptical about the text would look at the text and say, oh, we don't really know what happened, but Moses is a wonderful story. And to get to my conversation with Cale, so what if Jesus really fed the 5,000? Sharing is the miracle. And many of the rest of us hear that and say, no, that's not really how narratives actually work in our lives. We engage in these narratives and liturgies in order to actually see things happen in the real world. And what do we mean by in the real world? We mean not only in the material world, but in a world in which the culture layer and the physical layer are deeply joined. And this leads off into hundreds of other hours of videos that I do. So even though I'm not familiar with the Yale School or this particular narrative theology, I suspect, just by virtue of how the culture is tracking, that this is where it goes. And so in many ways, the theological enterprises that I'm working on are highly narrative. And what so often happens is someone might say, oh, that's over there in the academic realm. Yeah, but culture is, that broad river of culture is moving, and even very religiously very conservative people get swept up in it. And this is the reason why in the fundamentalist modernist controversy and fights of the late 19th and 20th centuries, fundamentalists are in some ways just as modernists as the modernists in terms of their presuppositions, but they're doing it a different way. And this is part of the reason that postmodernity bears some resemblance to pre-modernity, and why someone who is in many ways as ancient as Jonathan Pajot is suddenly fresh in a postmodern context, because we have a better understanding of patterns. So that's my best answer to that.
Cool. We'll open it up to the voice chat. Does anybody have any follow-up questions or questions for Paul?
Hey, Paul, this is CW. Have you read Hans Frey at all? Or
No.
Okay, yeah. You should totally, I know this is like the worst thing to do, but you should totally check out his Eclipse of Biblical Narrative.
Oh, even the title sounds interesting.
Yeah,
Hans Frey, Eclipse of Biblical Narrative.
Yeah, it's a pretty seminal work in that. I mean, into that whole discussion that you're talking about, to sort of attempt to rehabilitate liberal theology in the wake of the past 200 years of scholarship and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, a cousin of this way of thinking is Brevard Childs, and I was curious if you...
So I have read Childs.
Okay, yeah. He didn't really he got lumped in with these people because he was doing his thing at Yale at the same time that they were. He wasn't really happy about that, but he's in the same kind of universe of things.
Well, we're dealing with the same things. I mean, it's one thing to go to. So if you're a conservative Christian, you go to church and you're bowing on your knees and you're pleading with God to save your child that has cancer. And compare that to someone in the liberal church that their child has cancer, but everyone in the liberal church is sort of saying, oh, that's a real tragedy. I hope modern technology can resolve the cancer. And maybe you can enact these ancient liturgies and they would give you comfort, but they're not going to save your kid. Well, which church will you go to? Any parent, and parents going to say, well, I don't know if I believe the whole thing, but I'm gonna take my kid to the Benny Hinn rally. I'm gonna do whatever I can to save my kid. And this dichotomy illustrates part of the reason why the modernist church eventually found itself empty of people, because okay, well, I get the feels watching a movie too. And if you're basically saying that the Bible is just a good movie, well, I like good movies, I go see good movies, but when my child is dying, I want something that can save my child. And at one level, modernism says, well, we're trying to develop the medicine to save your child. Well, good, but it's probably not going to come to save my child. Is there a God? Is there a prophet in Israel? And that's the way that reality impinges on all of us, that it isn't real until all of the layers are engaged. So yeah, and in some ways, a really wonderful book by Andrew Root on the postmodern pastor, or the secular pastor in the secular age. I mean, that's what he's trying to. He's kind of a moderate. He's not all the way over to mainline, but that's what he's trying to wrestle with. I mean, what value is God in the secular frame when we no longer say maybe God will hear my prayers and heal my child from their deadly disease. I mean, that's a fundamental aspect of religiosity throughout the centuries. Okay, you don't believe it anymore. All right, well, and that's exactly the moment that we're in. And that's why what's going on in the church is going on in the church. So,
yeah, what's really interesting, you probably haven't seen this because it just premiered this week, but Ridley Scott, of Alien, Prometheus, Blade Runner fame, he has a new show called Raised by Wolves on HBO. And the premise is that there's this huge war on Earth between, AI and people, of course, right? Classic trope. But then they kind of flee Earth, and there's an ark that has these humans who are super religious. And then there's this little pod that has these atheist robots who are programmed to re-engineer humanity as atheist technocrats and therefore save the species from itself, kind of a thing.
Oh, I'm definitely going to watch that.
Yeah.
Well,
it's
that's
interesting
exactly
how these are spilling over into popular culture.
And what happened with Peterson is Peterson was right on that frontier. And that's why he triggered all of this, because he sort of stayed on the secular side of the line, at least with all of his disclaimers. Well, I'm speaking psychologically, I'm speaking as a scientist. So in that way, Peterson very much understood modernity. He was also postmodern enough to speak as a scientist and not just to do so naively. But then he also basically was open to the other. And that openness was what really annoyed Sam Harris, because what Sam Harris was about is that door is shut. Well, why are you working so hard to keep that door shut? Well, you have to work so hard to keep that door shut because that door is naturally open for people. And just because you take away religious institutions and broad, well-developed religious traditions doesn't mean that people aren't now going to be consulting their horoscope and looking for ghosts and. So no, and in truth, we've been at this stuff for 100 years, and we're not done with it yet. So
That's great, Paul. Thanks. I'll yield my time.
Can I add a comment there?
Sure.
Yeah. So I think it'll fit in well with what you're talking about with modernism. That you made a comment earlier about relegate God to the distinction of the categories of supernatural and natural event. And it clicked in my mind because I come from a very mega charismatic background, time at like the charismatic mecca of the West. And I think that gave language to something I've been noticing. The same is made there between supernatural and natural, flipped. So as you come to anti-modernism, and so anyway, I don't know if you could comment on that, because coming from, obviously it's not complete enough because it doesn't incorporate both. So I became a bit disillusioned without just throwing it out altogether, as much as I'd like to do. But I don't know if you could comment further on that.
Well, that's a lot of my own journey too, where, so, Nick is talking about a religious organization and a Christian movement. What's interesting about,
you can name it, Paul. It's all good.
Okay. So Nick is up in Reading at Bethel, and Bethel right now is the place to be in terms of North American and in some ways Western Christian signs and wonders. And Bill Johnson has written a couple of interesting books where he's basically challenging the church to say, if you really believe in Jesus, I'll say it this way, if you really believe in Jesus, I'll mess a couple of different traditions together, a fully devoted follower of Christ will be able to walk into Sutter Hospital downtown and empty that sucker. And part of me is thrilled by that vision. And we see some of that vision in the Gospel of Mark. And I preached on that a while ago when Jesus sort of goes into the Galilee, and some of the images of the story is basically Jesus goes into a town and heals everyone. And this is just a vivid, powerful image in my mind, and something which excites me. And so when a movement like Bethel sort of promises that, I get excited, because all around me are people that I desperately want to see healed. But then I keep reading in the text, and Jesus in the Galilee is healing people, and that isn't necessarily the center of the story, because I know many people who are as healthy as anyone today, and there's something more that Jesus is trying to do in their lives and in their hearts. That focus on, now again, we can't understand healing outside of this modernist medical physicalist paradigm that we are naturally susceptible to. We can't, in a sense, even a movement like Bill Johnson's movement is a modernist movement, because, okay, we're going to eliminate cancer and heart disease and blindness and, one leg being longer than the other and broken bones. I mean, we'll take it. We'll turn that knob all the way up. And now let's add some prosperity gospel people. And, everybody is praying to Jesus, oh, dear Lord, help me win the lottery. And there in my mind is a vivid sequence of numbers, and I write them down, and I run down to the gas station and I put them in, and I win the lottery, and I believe in God. Okay. What next? And it's a sense that the current dispensation cannot contain everything, all of the goodness that God intends for us. And because of that, some of the evil around us is limitation, and some of the evil around us is willful. But because of that, Jesus begins the story with us here and now. And I think that is exactly what the resurrection points to. In other words, if you, where I can't quite go all the way with Bill Johnson and his books that I've read, is that the same Jesus that heals everyone in a town in the Galilee hangs bloody on a cross. Why? What is he doing on that cross that is actually connected to what did he do in that town of Galilee? Then you add the resurrection. Then you add the ascension. All of these pieces have to fit together in a theological picture. I would love, let's pick a modern novel, Flowers for Algernon. Flowers for Algernon is a story of someone who basically they're sort of locked in, and then this drug, Awakening is a similar story, which is a true story. L-Dopa sort of opens up these people's lives, and now suddenly, at first there's just tremendous celebration because now they have life like they haven't had it before, and they can move and have love, and that's the first movement. But the second movement now is now they're able to rejoin their family members and their children, and now they have all of the complexity that comes along with the new agency that has been awarded to them by the drug. And then the power of the drug starts wearing off, and they recognize they are going to go back to being locked in. There is something in our current age that is like that. And Jesus in the resurrection and in his ministry understands that. And the works of deliverance that Jesus enacts, it's beautifully illustrated in the story of the paralytic by the pool. Because here's this paralytic, and he's been there a long time, and there's this mythology, the story that an angel descends and moves the water, and the first one into the water gets to be healed, and he's a paralytic. I mean, someone with a different disability can always get in first by virtue of the scheme. And Jesus is like, would you like to be healed? Yes. Well, that isn't necessarily an obvious question, not even to the person themselves. And, well, go and sin no more, or something worse might happen to you. What do you mean worse than being paralyzed? And I might be getting two stories mixed up, but anyway, the point is the same. Let's imagine a person in my life who has debilitating mental illness and suffers from their mental illness. Let's imagine that I, in a moment of clarity, suddenly embrace the mantle of Jesus' healing power to its fullness and go to that person and release them from their obsessive compulsive disability. Well, at first there's liberation, because they've been released from their they've been released from their obsessive compulsive. Okay. Now they can get off disability. Now they can go get a job. Now they can maybe have an adult romantic relationship. Now they can maybe have children. The whole realm of agency has just opened up in their life. Is it better? Well, yes and no. because now suddenly, now they're opened up to a romantic relationship and all of the heartbreaks and pleasures of a romantic relationship. Now they can have children. Now their children can be sick. There is something in this age that is like that Jesus' miracles, Jesus' crucifixion, Jesus' resurrection, Jesus' ascension, and the promise of a new heavens and a new earth address. And that's why the whole picture needs to be there. And that's where sort of a triumphalistic healing ministry or a triumphalistic prosperity gospel falls short. Because I think if those were right, Jesus' life story would have been very different. And even his approach to miracles would have been different. Because let's buy, for example, that Jesus could walk into a town and know not only everyone who had cancer, but everyone who was going to have cancer, and heal everyone who was going to have cancer too. Then what? Well, then what? Are their lives going to be perfect because they don't have cancer? Let's imagine a disease in which our fingers fall off painfully and randomly and continue to bleed. Well, maybe there is such a disease, maybe it's sort of like leprosy, but let's imagine this disease that we don't have or know about. Okay, we don't have this disease. Is your life better because you don't have this disease? Yes. But what if you're ignorant of the disease? Well, then you still have all the other problems that you have. The age of decay is such a thing that it's in some ways analogous to life in the wilderness. And I think this is, C.S. Lewis talks about this more vividly than anyone else I know when he talks about the fact that God liberally gives pleasure to the just and the unjust, the pleasures of food, the pleasures of parenthood, the pleasures of sex, the pleasures of a beautiful sunrise or a beautiful sunset, the pleasures all over the place, distributed liberally, but they don't last. I think of Dan Fogelberg's song, Why Doesn't Love Stay? I think about Jim Croce, If I Could Put Time in a Bottle. And C.S. Lewis says, the world we live in is not that way, so we don't get fixated on these lesser things that are actually portals or sacraments of greater things to come. And so in Jesus' story, the Son of Man is betrayed and crucified. And even this horror and pain and catastrophe and injustice are portals into a world the likes of which we cannot afford. And this goes back to the question, well, will there be chocolate with sex? I remember Lewis's comment on this. This is Lewis's answer to the question of sex in heaven. Will there be chocolate with sex? And the wise parent will say, you can have chocolate while you're having sex, but I don't know that that will exactly be what's on your mind at the moment. So, whereas on one hand, Jesus never discourages us to pray fervently for the healing and restoration of the physical needs of a friend or a relationship or any of these things. Ask for the desires of your heart. Absolutely. Do what we can to shed the unbelief that plagues us. But also understand that this age is not capable of affording and hosting the layers and levels of glory that we are made for and are tasting right now. And sometimes we are tasting that glory in a sunrise or in the jubilation of a medical breakthrough that heals a debilitating illness. But sometimes we can get intuitions of that glory by virtue of the illness itself. And our God is capable of doing these things. And that's why it's in the crucifixion of Jesus that the Gospel of John talks about the hour of his revelation. That something happens in that horrible, unjust, bloody, state-sponsored tyranny that reveals a glory. And that's why in the Gospel of John, the book of signs is the first part of the book where Jesus does these 7 signs, which are miracles, water to wine, healing of a paralytic, healing of a man born blind, etc., etc., and the book of glory. And the book of glory focuses on the catastrophe of the crucifixion. So again, Tolkien, a eucatastrophe. So I think Nick, keep doing what you're doing, because you have seen in some ways the wonderful celebrative glory of God's gift of Bethel to this world. And so I won't take anything away from that gift. But there's also the gift of the persecuted, struggling church, and the gift of, which is a strange non-gift of, so I have a friend who possesses amazing, miraculous gifts of insight and healing, the likes of which I have not seen in anyone else. And because of my friendship with this person and my knowledge of his godliness and his humility, I know that the stories he tells me are true. But this person has a child with a disability. And I know this person has prayed hours and hours for his child to be free of that disability. And his child has not been. And others who love that child will say, if God will work through you to heal these strangers, why won't he answer your prayers for your son? And I think of Paul and the thorn in the flesh, and Jesus saying to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, and my power is made perfect in your weakness. What is happening in Bethel is in some ways a revelation to us of the power of God in this work, in this world, and the availability of God's power. The kingdom of God is at hand. Dallas Willard writes about that so vividly, and that inspires and thrills me. That's part of the story. And I don't think we should take anything away from that story. But there's another part of the story in which Paul, who is far beyond me in knowledge and miracles and all of those things, my grace is made perfect in weakness. And I think that's the answer. And I think, again, all such answers are insufficient and sometimes discouraging. But as with children and sex, our Heavenly Father says to us, yeah, I'm going to keep these things from you for now. But trust me, there's coming a day when you will grow up into all of this, and you will be the kind of creature this world can't comprehend. And in a sense, the wish of Adam and Eve to know good and evil, even your rebellion will bear good fruit. Now, it cost me plenty, because it cost a break between the Father and the Son while he was there on the cross. And it cost the sacrifice of the Son of Man and Son of God to people unworthy of him. It cost all that. But my children, I love you that much that I can both say no to you in a way that might offend and discourage, and even have you walk out of the room and slam the door on me. But I am your Heavenly Father, and I know things you cannot know. And what I have in store for you, someday you will grow up into. and we will sit and laugh across my table and glory in the story of how I grew you up and made you to be the men and women and heroes I knew you were capable of, but could not understand in that day. And we will rejoice. And part of the beauty of Bethel is some of their music has the taste of that celebration. But today we also have music of lament. And our God is so good, and our God is so able, that this is the work he is doing. And when I see that and have that vision, oh, I'm thrilled.
That was really well articulated. A very wholehearted answer to something I've been wrestling with for a long time, so thank you. We'll go on to the next question. Following on the Just video, could we discuss further the hand wave of my inner belief versus Jesus saves? It was good to hear, as we have several dementia, Alzheimer folks in our church. It also resonated with my not hearing from Jesus, but being at peace with state I am in.
Hey, oh, okay, yeah, the waving. Again, this does my experiential phenomenological experience of belief. It's inside my head, and it gets manifest hopefully in obedience and discipleship and all of these things. Part of why I think this is so important is that part of the meaning crisis is the hermeneutic of suspicion, which gets manifest in just so stories in evolutionary psychology. It gets manifest in Freud, in the understanding that they are levels beneath our conscious self that are impinging on us. We can't help but connect the journey of our salvation. And when I'm using salvation right now, I'm using it in the full sense of the end of the last question, where I tried to describe the glory that awaits us and the hope that we have. When I was a kid, we'd go to the Jersey Shore, and the waves on the Jersey Shore aren't big like the waves in Hawaii. But I remember as a kid, when you're standing maybe in 2 or 3 feet of water and that next wave is coming in, that wave was bigger than me, and all you see around you are the waves. And that later on in life, that connected with me when the story of Peter walking on the water and he looks at the waves. So often in life, we are creatures of the moment, and we have to be. That's part of consciousness. And when 2020 hits, and you have a pandemic, and you have the worst fire season in California history, and you have one thing after another going on in people's lives. You know, political unrest, you've got political unrest over race, on and on and on and on and on. These experiential things colonize us deeply, and they must, because that's what consciousness is for, to somehow have the inner story and the outer reality meet in a cohesive, productive way. That's what consciousness is for. So part of what part of where we fail is heaven and earth aren't meeting up as they should. And so the me waving my hands around my head, that's sort of the inner narrative. But there's the outer world. And full reality is the meeting of both fully and completely. So with, Esther, and quite, I think a quite valid criticism, Esther said in the comment section, well, it's kind of a straw manning Arminian position. And yeah, I think she's right. That's probably was unfair. But part of what the Calvinist position, which is equally susceptible to cheap critiques and even threats of determinism, is sort of the other side of the coin. And so part of what we try to do is we try to put these coins together. The experiential, phenomenological, moment by moment consciousness that I am in the midst of has to be connected with something outside of me and beyond me. And if I too easily associate salvation with the feels that I get by going to a terrific church service, whether you're the liturgical type or the praise and worship type, whether you just get swept away and in that moment the world seems right, well, that's wonderful. But that moment's in your head. And what I am and who I am ties back, in the words of Jordan Peterson, to lobsters. And the a priori structure that's built into us has tons of things built in. And that's why the evolutionary biologists, and everybody's got a point there. If there weren't any points to make, now maybe they're not, maybe they don't, I know they don't get everything right. Well, neither do I. But there's reality to all of this. So we're always working in a bunch of dualities that we can't get right because we have to get, sounds fairly Hegelian, we have to sort of get to a higher resolution understanding where both are reflecting some degree of truth, and we have to understand deeper levels. So I've often thought, and as a pastor, you deal with this all the time with people. Someone will come in and they've just become a Christian and they're really excited and God is real and Jesus is great and the church is wonderful. And 2-3 years come later, something happened. They were betrayed. They were disappointed. It isn't working. God has left me. Was I just imagining it? It's like, well, yeah, you were imagining it. You use your imagination to know these things. But that doesn't mean that your imagination isn't connected to a reality. So a friend of mine has a great saying, don't doubt in the dark what you knew in the light. So think about yourself in a room that the light's on and you can kind of scan the room and see what's there, and then someone turns off the light and you have to find the door. Well, use what you saw in the light to help you navigate to the door. Now, part of walking in the dark means when you just saw the room for that moment, you don't know how far that chair is, or you didn't see everything in the room at all. But you do know something from what's in the room when you saw it with the light on. So now, in a sense, you're going to discover the room in a whole new way in the dark. And this, I guess, gets into the last question, too. You're going to know the room in darkness and in light. And there are things you're going to learn in the dark that you could never learn in the light. And there are things you learn in the light that you can't learn in the dark. And so I think for this reason, our Heavenly Father brings us through day and night, brings us through light and darkness, brings us through joy and suffering. Because I'll tell you, as a pastor, when I look around at people who have strong, reliable, enduring, durable faith, these are people who have suffered. they learned those things in the dark. And so when I meet with someone and they're struggling because they're in a dark place in their life right now, I'll certainly pray for their deliverance. I'll certainly pray for their comfort. I'll certainly pray for all of this. But part of me also knows God very well may be teaching them something through the darkness that they wouldn't have learned in the light. And so I will pray that all of this will, again, be part of the salvation, the sanctification, the readiness for glory. And again, we know all of this from children. I was blessed with having 5 very bright children. So much of school came easy to them until it didn't. And so I was happy when they were young to stretch them and to have them, well, I can't get the answer. Well, that's a problem when answers have always come easily. Well, good. Now what you need to learn is perseverance. Now what you need to learn is suffering. Now what you need to learn is that suffering, don't throw up your hands and walk away. Lean into the problem. Work the problem because there's glory at the other end of it. So pursue it. So our Heavenly Father gives us daylight and night, gives us good times and hard times. And generally speaking, with our lives, the older we get, our health starts to fade, the age of decay starts to eat at our loved ones, relationships break down. Get ready for the darkness because it's coming, but I believe darkness will lead to light and glory as well. So there's my answer. I hope it helps.
That was really well said. Thank you. Let's open it up to the voice chat. Does anybody have any follow-up questions or questions for Paul?
I have a question, Paul. What do you think the Apostle Paul meant when he talked about people not being unequally yoked? And do you think it is something more than just what I would think is probably the modern perception of just being married to someone who is a different religious view than yourself?
I think he definitely was talking about that. And I think in this case, the modern conception isn't far from the ancient conception. Here's a thing to think about in this context. You might be equally yoked when you start. That doesn't mean you're going to stay in the yoke well together. But if you understand what a yoke is, I think in many ways the idea is try to marry someone that at least you start out sort of on the same page. Because boy, I'll tell you, what does a yoke do between 2 oxen? 2 oxen won't naturally stay together. The yoke will keep them together. Now, if you have a mature, fully developed animal on one side and then an adolescent animal on the other side, that yoke isn't going to work very well. So what tends to happen is it's a rightful admonition to, at least as much as possible, if you can start on the same page, that'll help you when you get off the same page. Because part of what happens in marriage, if you're married a long time, is that people begin believing different things. They have different experiences. You're nowhere near as equally yoked as you imagined you were when you got married, because one of the things that you realize, when I was married, I had just turned 25 and my wife was about to turn 22. And looking back on ourselves now, we both laugh because we didn't know the other person. We barely knew ourselves. Now, again, when you're in your 20s, I didn't feel that way because I knew myself just fine because I was 25 years old and I was, had a degree under me and I was working on my second degree and had a lot of life experience and yada, yada, yada. But they had another 25 years of life experience. And the life experience I had then, well, and there's nothing wrong in that. That's just the way life goes. And so the admonition, well, is, do the best you can. And whether parents are whether there's a situation of arranged marriages or current conception where we're looking for someone, it's good advice. And that's what it is. It's good advice. But like much good advice, maybe you'll be able to live up to it. Maybe you won't. Who knows? But do the best you can. It'll serve you, because it's very difficult to be married to someone with whom there's not a high degree of religious agreement, because religious agreement is so foundational to many other layers. And like I've said before, with respect to when you get married, you don't realize that you've already, a first draft of what a marriage is already built into you. My wife and I have this joke because we got married and we didn't live together before we were married. And, morning came and I grew up. My mother got out of bed early and went down to the kitchen and made breakfast for the family and made certain foods for breakfast. And I had never thought of it, but I just expected my wife would get up and go to the kitchen and make breakfast for us. And she leans over and if I had been paying attention, I would have noted she doesn't eat breakfast much. She sort of drinks coffee and she makes it for herself. And her mother never made breakfast for her. And suddenly, here I had this first draft of what marriage was, which she didn't have that first draft. She had her own first draft. And so now suddenly we have to start putting it together. And there's joy and there's struggle and off you go. And that's where marriage is a yoke, because when both of those animals are pulling a plow, first of all, they'd like to not be at work, probably. Second of all, they don't want to do what the person behind them is telling them to do. Third of all, this other animal that they're yoked to is a pain in the neck, quite literally, with a yoke. And that's what the yoke is for. And sometimes that's what the whip is for. But in time, you learn and you grow and you discover. And Jesus never says he doesn't give you a yoke. He says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So no, it means what it means. It's a heck of a thing. And marriage itself is a heck of a thing. So when you're considering who could be a potentially good life partner, it's good advice. But the truth is, like most good advice, it's nearly impossible to live up to. So do the best you can.
Okay. Next question by Sherry. Paul, do you think virtue is something that can be... I'm sorry, somebody else?
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to follow up on my question about it. Sorry, I didn't jump in fast enough the first time around. I'm not that quick. Paul, I was interested about this hand thing about that, and the mixture of the two, that you need that initial experience. But it was interesting with the conversation with Jess how God had taken him through that sort of experiential moment, and then suddenly he got to a point where he left YWAM and he said, well, what do I do next, God? And God said, well, I'm not going to say. And actually just didn't say. And I thought that was quite interesting. And then you had another bit of conversation, then you came back to it. And I just thought that it was really helpful for me, coming from an experiential Bethel type church, but it's very, very small, and not really seeing it happen. And then the fact that the external Jesus saves bit sat there as well. And I just wanted to sort of ask you about that, because you got quite enthused about that, and you sort of, it felt like you were going somewhere, and obviously the conversation had to come to an end. And I just wanted to see if you had any further thoughts on that level, because I thought that yes, there's a thing in our heads that makes us believe and makes us feel good about our belief and makes us want to do good things with our belief. But actually, there's an external fact as well. And I know that your Calvinism might affect that. And I'm not sure I've got a Calvinism. I'm not even sure I've got an Arminianism. But I just thought, have you got any more thoughts on that you've after that conversation?
Well, I usually read the comment section because it furthers the thought, and I do like to think of my channel as an ongoing conversation, and conversations are much more fun with other people than just with myself. So I don't know. I think finally, the Calvinism thing is difficult because
I shouldn't have mentioned it.
No, that's okay. It's fine. I'm a ordained minister in a conservative Calvinist denomination, and I'm a signature of the canons of Dort, and so I've had to think about these things. And if I have to, it's quite clear our agency is required. If our agency wasn't required, why would Jesus invite people to believe? And so our agency is part of it, but it's the difficulty is figuring out this agency thing. And right there, you get into the experiential aspect of it. And so and then you get into God number one, God number two. You recognize that the God of redemption is the God of creation. This stuff is way bigger than we are. And I just think, what is Paul Vanderklay? Well, he's an individual. Well, that's true. And he's enveloped by skin. That's true. But, my father, my grandfather, the Christian Reformed Church, immigration, Sacramento, the consequences of sins and decisions that I've made that have brought me here, some achievements that I've struggled for and won, those have brought me here. When I imagine the salvation, which is such this rich, broad thing that I sketched out in my answer to Nick, I'm way too small to account for something that huge. I'm tiny. And so the little things that go on in my head, while they're important, yeah, but they're just a small piece of the picture. So I don't know if I'm answering your question or giving you more, or maybe, who knows, maybe more is yet to come. I don't know, but I don't know if I'm not exactly sure what more you're looking for. I don't know if I have it right now.
I'll wait for it.
Okay.
It was one of those theologos moments, I think, and I think it'll turn out some more. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Next question by Sherry. Paul, do you think virtue is something that can be cultivated, or does it result from the renewing of your mind as you journey further up and further in?
Oh, it's definitely something that can be cultivated, and it's definitely both. Part of the problem with answers like both is that they're not necessarily helpful, because there's this dynamic that I haven't really ever been able to fully articulate. It's seen in Jonathan Edwards' observation of diverse excellencies. It's seen in both and type thinking. Jesus is both more kind and stronger than our efforts and experiences of kindness and strength. And that's why Jesus, on one hand, can say to the woman with a sinful reputation who washes his feet with her tears and dries his feet with her hair, can say at the same time, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. And you'd say, when you look at Jesus and this woman, you say, well, he's soft on sin. And then, but you won't say that when you hear Jesus saying, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off, you'd say, he's an extremist. Well, how do you put these two things together? Well, Jesus seems to do that. And I think as we mature, we grow in our capacity to do that. And that's sort of like the Calvinist Arminian thing. Is salvation of the Lord? Yes. Work out your salvation in fear and trembling. Yes. Well, which is it? Well, it's both. But then you say, oh, there needs to be a balance. No, balance is the wrong idea, because Jesus doesn't balance the radical embrace of the sinful woman and the radical demand of putting away sin. He doesn't balance them. He says both of them at a volume we're not capable of. And so balancing is the way that we, in our low resolution, low capacity way, try to manage the obvious conflict. And the same goes with virtue. If you want to become virtuous, it's a difficult and hard road, and it's also a gift. And the renewing of your mind, well, I think I understand the question in terms of the gift aspect. And it's something that, it's sort of like, again, it's sort of like a child. In time, in developmental stages, like 5th and 6th graders can sometimes be highly legalistic and highly virtuous. And, well, that's wonderful. They can also be dogmatic and rigid and unbending. That's a problem. And so sometimes they have to grow out of some of their dogmatism to understand a deeper layer of virtue. Because rules are really good. Don't do this, do that. Rules are really good. Sometimes rules are bad. And you have to know when is when. And how do you know that? Well, that's wisdom. And virtue is in some ways wisdom acted out. And so to grow in virtue, you have to grow in wisdom. And to grow in wisdom, it usually means failing in virtue. And that's the way life is. But it's hard to lay out and deliver to others as such, because sometimes it's like pearls before swine. I can show my dog a gold coin. He'll sniff it and keep moving on. I said, no, it's a gold coin. What's gold to my dog? Gold is nothing. I show him a piece of meat. Oh, I say, I can buy a truckload of meat for this gold coin. That's a world that my dog does not have purchase upon. So, yeah, it's both. But that doesn't really answer the question to our satisfaction. But that's where we're at. All right, last question.
Okay, last question is, what is personhood? As it relates to us and God and us being in a personal relationship with God, which is what Christians generally say. God as a personal being, us being person. I apologize in advance if the question is kind of vague or open-ended.
Oh, it's a good question, and it's one that I wrestle with all the time, because it gets into this group A and group B dynamic, where group A are things that we consider impersonal and rightly colonized, and group B persons are these beings that have agency and responsibility and image bearing. And part of what the meaning crisis is the recognition that there's a whole lot of formation into our personhood. It's the discovery of the truths of psychology and evolutionary biology, and it's all of those things. And so if we embrace the limitations of our capacity on the concept, it doesn't mean the concept itself has to go, and I think that's probably where we're going to go with the whole, let's say, the Turing experiment. So the Turing experiment is, at what point will a bot on a phone be able to fool a human being? What are increasing development and experience with AI, artificial intelligence, even the name of it? It's basically intelligences that we have created. It's as if we don't understand that many of our creations, even ancient ones, have grown beyond us. We build a car, and the car takes our life. What's with that? So a person is just, in a low resolution way, someone, we use that we can have a conversation with. And there are qualities to that. There are aspects to that. But, a lot of Vervaeke's work in this I found really helpful, because what there are in persons is a frontier of the infinite. And I think part of that is built into the image of God talk. That when we are talking to another human being, yes, they are fully here. Yes, there's an envelope of skin. Yes, there's a birth date and probably a certificate of death waiting at the other end. But this person is a portal into another world. And that must be respected. And when we don't respect it, we ourselves cease becoming persons. There's I haven't heard a lot of chatter about universalism lately in the Discord, or annihilationism, or eternal conscious torment, or all of these things. C.S. Lewis intimates in his book, The Great Divorce, some interesting things. One of the things that he notes is, at what point does a person who grumbles just become a grumble? Essentially, what he's noting in contemporary meme language is that sometimes when we give ourselves over to sin, temptation, we lose our personhood. Is that annihilation? There is more built into these images in Scripture than we can imagine. And I really like Vervaeke's agency scheme that shows addiction as being a reciprocal narrowing. And if we see examples of reciprocal narrowing, isn't it also possible that there's such a thing as reciprocal broadening? And I think that's what the Bible, I think that's a fair way of talking about what the Bible talks about in terms of our salvation. That we actually grow in agency, that we actually grow in power, but that growth in agency and power is not simply the mere manipulation of matter. It goes beyond that. And that, again, also gets back into the Bethel church question. Yes, your kidneys should function more like they did when you were 8 than when you were 70. But life is not about kidney functioning. Kidney functioning is important to life. Just take it away. But life is not about kidney functioning. Life is a portal to another world, the likes of which we are made for, but are not yet ready for. And personhood is an element of this. In our resurrection, there's a binary element to personhood, which we respect. This is a person. This is why Christians, feel very passionately about abortion and euthanasia and human rights. But part of that, and this is sort of where part of that is, Christians also feel very passionate about agency. And we should. So we should, on one hand, respect agency, because that's part of personhood, and respect biology, because that's part of personhood. Now, the personhood of agency and biology that I think we're growing up into is beyond what we currently experience. And again, Lewis talks about that. He said, in the life of the age to come, the kinds of people we will be, if we were to see them now, we would be tempted to fall down and worship them. And those are images of things that are scaling beyond what they are now. And so, yeah, that's defining personhood is really hard. Part of it is because we're a pattern looking at a pattern. But we have a pretty good idea of it. It's good enough, and it involves agency. It involves an element of sacramentality, that each person that we meet is a portal into an entirely new existence. And to sound terribly Arminian at the moment, each decision we make either takes us further into our personhood scaling up into the life of the age to come, or further into the diminishment of our agency and the reciprocal narrowing that is hell itself. And that's why in the Great Divorce, someone takes the bus ride and is trying to bring some little tidbit of those foothills onto the bus, because they want a real thing to bring back down to the shadowy city, because if they'd only have a real thing, then they could scale up their reality and economy. And one of the beings of light says, you don't understand. There's a blade of grass here is greater than that infinitely dark and shadowy city that is just built in the minds of the people who live there. There's a scale problem. And I think that scale problem is also true here in terms of personhood, that in Christ, the reciprocal broadening brings us into persons of great power. Look at the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. That's all personhood. And by the Spirit of God, we level up as persons. And in a sense, I think that's part of the dynamic of my grace is sufficient for you, in that we reach our limits here, and the limits are partly what this age can afford. And I think that is part of what we see in Jesus' story, where he becomes a zygote, and then becomes an embryo, and then becomes an infant, and then becomes a boy, and then becomes a teenager, and then becomes a man, and is the Son of Man, and then is crucified, and he's raised. Don't cling to me, Mary. And he ascends, and he is the image of what we are growing into. And the persons that we will be probably make the persons we are today look something like children. So that's probably as good as I can do right now, and our time's sort of up. So I think we'll call it there. Great questions today. I hope the answers were helpful.